Okay, we continue our discussion of the development of halachic literature, and we're now going to review Masechet Adayoth from the Mishna, Seder Nezikin, and look at some references there to the process of Mesirat HaHalacha. So, as I mentioned last time, Masechet Adayoth is understood as an anthology of halachot that were attested for. The Tosfot Yom Tov says, עניין זאת המסכת ולזכור בה כל ההלכות שהעידו עליהם אנשים ברורים ונאמנים ושעדותם ראויה לסמוך עליה. So those are halachot that were testified upon by trustworthy people. So the Mishnah starts, so because of that, we'll see through the Masechet, the halachot cover many different themes and concepts. So the Mishnah starts with the mahloket between Shammai and Hillel. Shammai omer, kol anashim dayan sha'atan, v'Hillel omer mipekida lifkida. I'm not going to enter into the exact nature of the halacha, just there's a dispute between Shammai and Hillel, and then Hachamim, the rabbis, give us a balanced view between those two extremes, Shammai and Hillel. In Mishnah, in the second Mishnah, similar story. Shammai says A, Hillel says B, Hachamim say in between. But here, the interesting thing about this Mishnah that I want to point out, they're talking about measurements. So Shammai Omer, the measurement is 1 kav. Hillel says 2. Hachamim say 1.5. But here we read, "Umishehigdilu hamidot amru hameshet reva'im hayavim." Mishehigdilu hamidot, and after they increased the measures, they said, just a sort of like a minute item to pay attention to. But this is attested to in the Mishnah, "Mishehigdilu hamidot," that the measurements were changed. That was the measures were changed, that were increased. That was a common thing in antiquity until. In modern time, a standard measure, the metric system in Europe was decided as a sort of global system. Each country had its own system, and sometimes each emperor, each governor would introduce a new system. So that is a sort of reference to a concept that is very important in the study of Torah, of halacha, and that is the seat in life, the circumstances. We can't look at a kazait, for example, kebetza, whatever it is, today, and think that this is exactly what it was before, that they're referring to an absolute measurement that was given by biblical law. Just that. Now, Mishnah 3. Hillel omer, melohin mayim she'uvim poslin et hamikveh, Ela she'adam hayav lomar bilshon rabo. Now here we find in this Mishnah a very interesting phenomenon. So let's go through this Mishnah a little bit more in depth. Hillel says a hin full of drawn water renders the mikveh unfit. So the mikveh has to be filled with water, rainwater that were not drawn by men, and but if drawn water was added to it, it's okay up to a certain amount. And Hillel said that amount is a hin. It's a liquid measure, an ancient liquid measure. But he adds, Ela she'adam hayav lomar b'shon rabo. However, one must quote his master verbatim. Adam hayav b'shon. Why is he saying it here? What's the point of that statement? We'll see later. V'Shammai omer tisha kabin. Shammai says it's 9 cups of water. V'Hachamim omrim, and again, as in Mishnah 1 and Mishnah 2, after the dispute between Shammai and Hillel, Hachamim give us a balanced halacha between the two opinions. Lo kedivrei ze v'lo kedivrei ze, neither according to the opinion of one nor the other. Ela עד שבאו שני גרדיים משער האשפות שבירושלים, והעידו משום שמעיה ואבטליון, 3 לוגין מים שאובין פוסלין את המקווה, וקיימו חכמים את דבריהם. We do not follow either Hillel neither Hillel nor Shammai, but rather we follow the testimony of two weavers from they call it the dung gate, Sha'ar Ashpot, which is in Jerusalem. Sha'ar Ashpot not necessarily meant that ashpa as garbage or trash. That's a sort of modern interpretation of that. Ashpa in Hebrew means quiver, where a marksman keeps the arrows. So that's the ashpa. It's sort of like the armory. So Sha'ar Ashpot is the armory in Yerushalayim. Ve'e'idu mishum Shmaya ve'Avtalion, and they testified in the name of Shmaya and Avtalion. 3 logs of drawn water render the mikveh unfit, and the sages confirm their statement. So interesting that at the end of this discussion, the testimony that is accepted is of 2 weavers. They're not scholars, they're not necessarily part of the Bet Midrash, but they have a testimony that goes back to the masters of Hillel, Shmaya ve'Avtalion. Why is it it's interesting and thought-provoking? Because we mentioned several times the statement of later generations regarding disputes, saying, how come we have so many mahlokot, so many disputes between the students of Shammai and students of Hillel? And the answer of the rabbis to that is, Bisherabu Talmidei Shammai ve'Hillel shelo shimshu kol tzorkam rabu mahlokot biYisrael, right? But here we see that Hillel and Shammai themselves were not meshamesh kol tzorkam. What is leshamesh kol tzorko? Leshamesh kol tzorko is to serve your rabbi, to study with your master until you fully grasp all of his knowledge. And here we have a dispute between Hillel, who was the dedicated student of Shammai and Avtalion. I'm going back to remind you, like one of the first sugyot that we've studied together was from Masechet Pesachim, when they had a debate. They were asking whether Korban Pesach, if the 14th of Nisan falls on Shabbat, does it override Shabbat or not, right? And eventually they had to rely on Hillel. And after they accepted Hillel's opinion, Hillel teased them, saying, you know what caused this to you? שלא שימשתם את שני גדולי הדור, שמעיה ואבטליון. Hillel rebukes Bnei Betera, tells them, you don't know the halacha because you didn't study enough under Shmaya ve'Avtalion. And here we have a case of a halacha that Hillel does not know. And those 2 weavers know as tradition from Shmaya ve'Avtalion. And it's not just an obscure halacha. It's the question of the validity of a mikveh. We assume that everywhere in Eretz Israel there were mikvaot, and we assume that they had difficulties filling them during times of drought. So they always have to add some amount of drawn water. That should be like a very simple halacha that everybody knows. Yet there's a rupture in the chain of transmission, and it's Hillel who doesn't know the halacha, and we rely on the idut of the 2 gardiim of those 2 weavers. Even more interesting is that Hillel says, Hayav Adam Omar Bishon Rabo. He says, I'm quoting my rabbi verbatim. This is exactly what he said. Now, why is he saying it here? That's a question that was addressed by Rabbi Hanoch HaKohen Aaron Troy, was one of the Talmidim of the Hatam Sofer, and he wrote a small book called Ayunim B'divrei Hazal Ulshonam, where he looked at problematic statements, linguistic statement in rabbinic literature, and this is one of them. It's a brilliant book. He says this: Hillel Omer, Melo hin mayim she'uvim poslim et hamikveh. A hin full of water renders a mikveh unfit. Right. The question is, why does Hillel say melo hin, a full hin or a handful of water? Why doesn't he just say hin mayim she'uvim poslim et hamikveh? Why do you have to say full? Obviously, if it's hin, it's a full measure. The answer is that Shmaya ve'Avtalion, his masters, were converts. and their spoken language, according to Rabbi Aaron Troy, was Greek. And the Greeks had a problem pronouncing the H. It is recorded in the several places in the Talmud. For example, it says that the people of Bet She'an, which was a mixed city of Greeks and Jews, the people of Bet She'an cannot pronounce the Aleph and the Hey correctly, and therefore they cannot lead the Tefillah, they cannot be Hazanim. So we know that that was a problem for Greek speakers in Eretz Israel. So because Shemaya and Avtalion spoke Greek, they weren't able to say Hin Maim Shuvim Posim et HaMikveh, because that would sound like Aleph and Maim Shuvim Posim et HaMikveh. Drawn water does not render the mikveh unfit, and that's why they had to add the word melo before a full. So you know they're referring to the measure of hin, melo hin, right? A full hin of water, and not en maim. And that's why he adds ela she'adam hayav lomar b'shon rabo. He apologizes for that cumbersome way of phrasing the halacha, because he must quote his rabbi. So Hillel insists that he quotes his rabbi verbatim, even though the formula is a bit strange. Yet the rabbis say, no, we don't trust your testimony nor Shammai's testimony. We follow the two weavers who came Mishara Ashpot. Now ask the Mishnah in the next Mishnah, Mishnah 4. ולמה מזכירים את דברי שמאי והלל לבטלה? ללמד לדורות הבאים שלא יהיה אדם עומד על דבריו, שהרי אבות העולם לא עמדו על דבריהם. So why do we record the opinions of Shammai and Hillel for naught? We don't follow in those two Mishnayot, neither Hillel nor Shammai, three Mishnayot actually. So the answer is to teach the following generations that one should not insist in his opinion. For we see that the fathers of the world, those great sages, Hillel and Shammai, did not persist in their opinion. So it assumes that Shammai and Hillel were there when the two Gardiim presented their testimony, and they accepted it. ולמה מזכירים דברי היחיד בין המרובין? So here we come to a methodological question. Why do we record the opinion of a single person among the many? הואיל ואין הלכה, אלא כדברי המרובין. We know that the halacha must be determined according to the opinion of the many. שאם יראה בדין את דברי היחיד ויסמוך עליו, שאין דין יכול לבטל דברי בדין חברו עד שיהיה גדול ממנו בחוכמה ובמניין. So the opinion of the single, of the minority, is mentioned because if a court prefers the opinion of a single person, it may depend on him. So at this point, it seems that the Bedin could rely on the opinion of an individual. And the Mishnah continues, אין בדין יכול לבטל דברי בדין חברו עד שיהיה גדול ממנו בחוכמה ובמניין. No court may set aside the decision of another court unless it is greater than it in wisdom and in number. היה גדול ממנו בחוכמה אבל לא במניין, במניין אבל לא בחוכמה. And if it was greater than the previous bedin. Sorry, not a previous, I'll correct myself, than the other bedin. In wisdom but not in number but not in wisdom, אינו יכול לבטל דבריו עד שיהיה גדול ממנו בחוכמה ובמניין. It may not set aside his decision unless it is greater than it in wisdom and in number. אמר רבי יהודה, I'm going to go back to this Mishnah in a second. אמר רבי יהודה, אם כן, למה מזכירים דברי היחיד בין המרובים לבטלה? If so, why do they record the opinion of a single person among the many to set it aside? שאם יאמר האדם כך אני מקובל, יאמר לו כדברי איש פלוני שמעת. Because if one says, I have received a different tradition, they will tell him, you have heard the refuted tradition. So once we read Mishnah 6, we go back to Mishnah 5, and we understand that the second paragraph of Mishnah 5 is a question and not a statement. And the question is whether it was like that from the beginning. Meaning, like we look at those two Mishnayot in tandem, and we read it thus. The Mishnah asks, why do you mention the opinion of the individual? You cannot follow the halacha of the individual. And if you will say, if you will tell me that it is in order for a bedin to rely on the opinion of the individual, a bedin cannot override another bedin. So what does it help? So, and then Rabbi Yehuda answers, it's in order for us to reject the opinion of someone. If he says that is my tradition, we'll tell him that this is an individual opinion. So that's one way to read it. A different way to read it, and maybe it was added in layers to the Mishnah, that the original Mishnah ended here. Why do we mention the words of the individual among the many? To let the future bedin rely on the opinion of the individual. So I'll stop here for a second. So we see from this, we could go back to this Mishnah, you could study with the commentators, but this Mishnah presents serious challenges. What does the Mishnah say? Does it say that you can rely on the opinion of the individual or not? And like I said, it seems like we had different forces in motion here. What I think is happening here is that, like I said, first the first layer of the Mishnah said, we mentioned the words of the opinion, the individual opinion among the many, to give you an option to rely on that opinion. But the future generations felt this is not good because it gives room for dissent, for dispute. Maybe it's part of the agenda of Rabban Gamliel, who tries to create a uniform halacha for all. So we say you cannot override the previous another bedin unless you're greater than that bedin, and therefore, though we mentioned the opinion of the individual, just to tell you in case you try to rely on it, it is not reliable. This is not the opinion that we should rely on. I'll pause here for a second. So Daphne asked a great question, like, do we have any linguistic characteristics that could tell us that there is a shift? So sometimes, yes, you could see a characters like that. As we saw in the beginning of Masechet Kiddushin, the question v'chama, like how much is it? And the because if it was part of the original layer, they would say bishve pruta, right? This is the amount, and the amount is this and that. Why are you asking a question? You ask a question because you've been reciting it for a while, and then you say, "Oh, wait, I have a question," and that adds into. So I think the word velama in itself is a marker for that. It is not as much as a layer of a different layer of the language, which is something that we could find in the Talmud. In the Talmud, when we get there, we'll see that there are certain phrases and statement that reflect a later dialect of Aramaic in Babylonia, something that happens 200 or 300 years after the official closure of the Talmud. But here we're still within a very narrow linguistic era, so they still have they speak the same language. But I think that the word velama and why is a marker of an addition. So as they're reading the Mishnah, they raise questions and they put it in still in the oral form. And here it repeats twice. Amar Rabbi Yehuda im ken lama, meaning the question was raised, someone answered, and the answer was not satisfying to Rabbi Yehuda, and he adds another layer. So almost we could say that we have 3 layers: the original statement, the question, and then another question by Rabbi Yehuda. Now, one important point that I want to make here, and probably you've heard me saying it in other classes, but I will say it again, that is this paragraph, en bedin, this rule, en bedin yachol levatel divrei bed din havero, עד שיהיה גדול ממנו בחוכמה ובמניין. The bedin cannot override the ruling of another bedin unless it is greater than it in wisdom and in number. This is how it is translated. Now, if we're talking about one bedin that is a bedin that tries to override a previous bedin discussion, right? Then the label for the other bedin is not havero. Havero sounds like a colleague, a companion. It's they are on the same level. If we are talking about a previous bedin, we should have said she'en bedin yachol levatel divrei bedin kodmo, a bedin that came previously. That is one point. The other point is, since we find throughout rabbinic literature and even later on the idea that the more we are moving away from the giving of the law on Har Sinai, from the source, our wisdom is diminished. So the previous generations were always greater than us. Then you will never have a bedin which meets those conditions, because you will always lesser in chokhmah than the previous bedin, right? So I think, therefore, that the this phrase has been misinterpreted. Bedin could always override the decision of a previous bedin, because it is what we call shofet shebedoro, shofet shebeyamecha. It is the contemporary bedin. It's the one who knows the situation, who knows the circumstances, and knows the people. Could also determine whether the halacha that was established in previous generations is applicable today or not. So what is the meaning of that statement? It means this, that when you have two batei dinim, two courts in the same place at the same time, one cannot override the decision of the other unless it is greater in wisdom and in number. And that makes sense, because within one territory at one time, you want to establish the rule of law. And that is before different communities were formed, like we have today in cities or in Israel. Each one follows a completely different halacha. And with that understanding, we also have to have in mind that the word minyan doesn't mean number, but rather minyan means quorum. How many of the we could say it probably mean more percentage. If the majority of the bedin, or maybe a super majority, overwhelming majority, decided, then it is a decision, because maybe the previous bedin had 10 members and now we have 7 members. It doesn't matter. It's not the number of people that determines the halacha, but within that authority, as it is established, the voice of the majority is what counts. So this is a different take on that statement, and now it makes sense. Lama maskirin. Now we can go back to the original statement of the Mishnah. Velama maskirin divrei yachid ben hamerubin. Why do we record the opinion of the individual among the many? She'im yireh bedin et divrei yachid yismoch alav. That you could rely on it. The bedin, the later bedin, not within the contemporary bedin, but they dinim in the courts. The opinion of the yachid does not count. But as a later bedin, they could do that. But even with contemporary batei dinim, if one of them is greater than the other, and that greater bedin accepts the opinion of the individual and rules by it, then we will have to accept it. So this is something to take from these Mishnayot, and I recommend going back to Mishnah 5 and 6 of chapter 1 in Masechet Adayoth and studying them with in depth with commentators and the way they were quoted later in the rabbinic literature. Any questions on this last statement about the authority of the Batei Dinim? Because that has major applications to today's halacha. We are, I said it just like that, but as a matter of fact, that has major impact on halacha today, because in many cases, the rabbinical system is stuck in the past. It says we cannot override the decision of previous generations, because we are not greater than them. They had 71 members, they had great wisdom, but we have a greater wisdom because we have the accumulated wisdom of the generations, we have the historical perspective, and we understand the today's necessities more than anyone else. No rabbi in the time of the Talmud could have given an opinion that would take into account technology, Zoom, bioethics, in vitro fertilization, cloning, the mapping of the human genome, a million other things that we have today. The understanding of gender. This is, if they would have lived today, they would have taken into account. What they would have wanted the Batei Din of today to do is to take responsibility. And when they said En bedin yachol levatel b'divrei bedin havero, they meant when you have contemporary batei dinim, you should give priority to that bedin which masters the wisdom, the knowledge necessary, and then there is a vote within that bedin. Okay, so let's continue to the next Mishnah that is of importance to us. So Bet Shammai Omrim, same thing. We have Mahloket in Mishnah 7, Mishnah 8, Mishnah 9, Mishnah 10, between Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel. Mishnah 10 is interesting, just to see the opinions that are exchanged here. One who exchanges a selah from second tithe in Jerusalem. The halacha is that when the fruits that the tithes that you give from the crops from the tevuah on the first, second, fourth, and fifth years of the 7-year cycle, those fruits should be, those ma'asrod, the 10% should be taken to Yerushalayim and eaten there. But if you live far away from Yerushalayim and there's a concern that the fruits will rot on the way to Yerushalayim, you're allowed to exchange to transfer the value, the worth of those fruits to money, and then take the money to Yerushalayim and then exchange it again and transfer the kedusha, the sanctity of those tithes, to food. So now you have to you come with one big coin called selah, and you need to break it down to smaller coins in order to go and buy from vendors whatever you need. So what do? Bet Shammai omrim b'chol hasela ma'ot, uvelel omrim b'shekel kesef v'shekel ma'ot. So the question is, now that you break it down to small coins, you're going to lose the exchange rate. So how much of that? How do you make the exchange? So according to Bet Shammai, you exchange the whole selah for copper coins. Bet Hillel say half of it for silver coins, half of it for copper coins. The Danim Lifnei Hachamim, those who were teaching, he said disputants, but really means those who teach halachot in the presence of the scholars, say 3/4 go to silver coins and 1/4 to copper coins. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Bishlosha dinarim kesef, uvirvi'it kesef virvi'it ma'ot. Rabbi Akiva breaks it down the way they would do with the fractions. Fractions is first put 3/4 aside for silver, and of the remaining fourth, give 1/2 to silver, 1/2 to copper. Rabbi Tarfon Omer arba'a aspere kesef. He says 4 aspers of silver, and the rest goes to copper. Shammai Omer yanichena b'chanut ve'yochal kenegda. Shammai says just leave the coin as a deposit in the store and buy and get food from the vendor for it until you run out of value. Like it's almost like a debit card. How many opinions the Mishnah on that? Bet Shammai 1, Bet Hillel, Adanim Lifnei Hachamim, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Tarfon, and Shammai himself. 6 opinions. 6 opinions regarding an act that would take place at the time of the temple it's not even every other year. Out of 7 years, 4 years. Yes, we could say mostly every other year. Year 1 of the Shemitah, year 2 of the Shemitah. Then you skip a year, then year 3 or 4 of the Shemitah, year 5 of the Shemitah, then you skip the 6th and the 7th, and so on. So for 4 years out of 7, people would bring money to Yerushalayim. Thousands of people probably in the thousands, according to Mishnah estimates tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people. So you tell me that thousands of people come to Yerushalayim every year. They bring their coins, they go to the money changers, and they exchange them. And you have 6 different opinions of how this is done. Is there only one correct opinion? Is this his testimony? Are they saying that there were 6 different ways to do it? Or is this just hypothetical? Nobody really knows what they used to do. This is in the 2nd century. It's Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel, and it happens after the destruction of the temple. This is no longer taking place in Yerushalayim. I don't have an answer for that. Just raising that as a problem. When we look at the traditions recorded in the Mishnah, and we ask how much of it is true and reflecting reality, and how much of it is hypothetical, I think this is a kind of Mishnah that tells us that we really have a problem with that understanding. Yes, Katriel.
I was gonna say, even with all of those opinions, it's kind of, I think about my kids. If I ask them, what did you see? Each of them will give me a different opinion of the same thing that they saw. So the fact that we had different rabbis who were probably of different ages, maybe at different angles, they could have all seen something completely different, but all saw the same exact thing. I mean, that's what I hear when I hear that there were different opinions of how one particular thing was done.
I agree with that. That could happen sometimes with the question of perspective, but here we are talking about amounts of money. So you come with a silver dollar. Do you get 75 cents and 1/4, or you get 100 cents, or you get 50 cents and 2/4 or half dollar? Maybe all of these things were practiced. So that is not, it's not perspective, it's just like they saw different things. And if they saw different things, that means that there was no rule. There was no really set rule of how do you exchange money in Yerushalayim. You come to the money changer, whatever he has coins, he has silver, he has copper, he will give it to you. And maybe this is what it shows us. It shows us that there's an attempt at the time of solidifying the Mishnah to create a uniform halacha, one rule for all. And this is a perfect example to show us it doesn't work. Maybe, just like, for example, right? If Bet Shammai win b'chol aseh ma'ot, right? You have to convert your silver dollar to 100 copper coins, 100 cents. What if you are a very wealthy man and you came with 100 selas, right? Are you going to go now dragging, mountains of copper coins in Yerushalayim? Maybe here the opinions of Rabbi Akiva of 3/4 and 1/4, right? Which would be so what does he want there? Are we talking about eighths? Yeah, right. So yeah, 7/8 will go for will be in silver and 1/8 in copper, right? Makes more sense. So maybe that was the thing. It was more individual thing, but and Shammai's opinion is also very practical. Just leave it in the store, take credit for it, and just instead of going in Yerushalayim dragging money with you, you have credit in the store. So I think this Mishnah shows us the flexibility of the living halacha versus the rigidity of the written halacha and the attempt to make it uniform. Okay, so Mishnah 11 again, Bet Shammai, Bet Hillel, Shammai, they have this mahlokot. Now, Mishnah 12 again is a question of methodology. And Elu devarim shehazeru Bet Hillel lehorot kedivrei Bet Shammai. Here are the issues in which Bet Hillel, the students of Hillel, changed their mind and started ruling like divrei Bet Shammai. What are they? Ha'isha sheba mimedinat hayam ve'amra met ba'ali tinase, met ba'ali tityabem. A woman came from overseas. She left with her husband, but she came back alone, and she said, "My husband has died." Now we trust her because we say in this discussion in the Gemara that she would not lie about something like that, especially since her husband can easily prove her wrong if he comes back. If he shows in front of Bedin and says, I'm alive, then we'll know he's alive. So we assume that she's not lying. So if she says, my husband died, she could marry. If she has children from him, or she should do the Levirate law if she doesn't have children. בית הלל אומרים, לא שמענו אלא בבא מן הקציר בלבד. בית הלל say, the people of בית הלל say, we have heard so only in the case of one who came from the harvesting. So there was a real case like that. A woman came back from harvesting. She and her husband went, apparently the field was far away, and she came back alone, and she said that her husband died during the harvest season. And the rabbis accepted her testimony and let her get married. And Bet Shammai, the students of Bet Shammai respond to them saying, אחת הבאה מן הקציר, ואחת הבאה מן הזיתים, ואחת הבאה ממדינת הים. לא דיברו בקציר, אלא בהווה. So they say it is the same thing if she comes from the harvesting, or if she comes from olive picking, or if she comes from overseas. You almost hear, I would say, exasperation in the voice of Bet Shammai. That say, okay, come on, really, you think it's only from it makes no sense. It's not because of special circumstances, but because of what I mentioned before. We trust her to say the truth, because she wouldn't lie about her husband's death. It doesn't matter if she comes back from harvesting wheat or picking olives or from overseas. And Bet Hillel accepted the logic of Bet Shammai. Then there's another case where it's not about the expansion of a single case to all similar cases, but rather about a legal discussion where, again, Bet Hillel accept the rule of Bet Shammai. The next Mishnah 13, again, it's a logical argument between Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai regarding a slave who was owned by two masters and only one of them released him. In Mishnah 14, another example of Bet Hillel ruling like Bet Shammai. Now, we're moving on to chapter 2. Rabbi Hanina, Sgan HaKohanim, העיד ארבעה דברים. We read about Rabbi Hanina. It says chief of the priests, but it really means the second to the priests. העיד ארבעה דברים. He testified concerning 4 matters. And that has to do with the first one is about meat of korbanot that became impure. What do you do with it? Here I just want to remark that his title is interesting. Why is it called Rabbi Hanina, Sgan HaKohanim, the second in command to the Kohanim? Was he a Kohen or not? So in a manuscript I worked on years ago by Rabbi Haram al-Ashkar, I read that Rabbi Hanina was called Sgan HaKohanim because he was always passed over when they were looking for a new Kohen Gadol. They did not consider him because he was a scholar. And at the time, the position of the Kohen Gadol was given to people who were close to the government, to the Greek or Roman government, would bribe the officials to appoint them. So Rabbi Hanina is the scholar stranded in the temple, never getting the position of high priest because he's not a Hellenizer or close to the rulers of the temple. Now, in that Mishnah, Hosif Rabbi Akiva adds an halacha. Just as you tell me this halacha regarding the meat that became impure, I can tell you halacha about oil that became impure. The difference between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Hanina is that Rabbi Akiva was born after the destruction of the temple. Or if he was born before, it was a baby. He didn't remember anything from the service of the temple. Yet he he testifies about a halacha like that. Same in Mishnah 2. Rabbi Hanina Sgan HaKohanim makes a statement regarding the hide of the animal, and Rabbi Akiva says, "I learned something from what he says." The third testimony of Rabbi Hanina Sgan HaKohanim is interesting. אף הוא העיד על כפר קטן שהיה בצד ירושלים, והיה בו זקן אחד, והיה מלווה לכל בני הכפר, וכותב בכתב ידו ואחרים חותמים. First, the Hebrew, those of you who are Hebrew speakers, you hear the Hebrew, it's very, it sounds very contemporary. Like if I would just look at the second phrase, והיה בו זקן אחד והיה מלווה לכל בני הכפר, every any Hebrew speaker today would understand, and it would not only would understand the phrase, for them would be could be a phrase that was lifted out of a newspaper, of a media outlet today, and that is because the language of the Mishnah is you could say is one of the maybe became the main layer of spoken Hebrew today, the style of Mishnaic language. We have a lot of biblical elements, we have a lot of medieval elements, but overall, the style that we have adopted is very close to the style of the Mishnah. In any case, the story is of a small village in the vicinity of Yerushalayim, in which there was an old man who used to lend all the people of the village and write out the bond in his own handwriting, and others signed it. And when the fact was brought before the sages, they pronounced it legal. So interesting testimony of the way documents were written, and from that the Mishnah comments, לפי דרכך תלמד שהאישה כותבת את גיתה והאיש כותב את שוברו, that a woman could write her own get, she could write the document as long as other people sign it. Not something that would fly today. Then in Mishnah 4, 3 things by Rabbi Ishmael. In Mishnah 5, 3 things that were said in front of Rabbi Ishmael. In Mishnah 6, 3 things that Rabbi Ishmael said and Rabbi Akiva disagreed with. In Mishnah 7, 3 things that were said in front of Rabbi Ishmael, of Rabbi Akiva. Mishnah 8, we see now we're listing kind of categories. 3 things that Rabbi Akiva said, they agreed with him on 2, but not on the 3rd. And then the next 2 Mishnayot of chapter 2 seem like the conclusion of that part of Masechet Adayoth. Remember that we mentioned that one of the markers of the end of a unit in the Mishnah is Divrei Agada. So after the list of Mishnayot in which Rabbi Ishmael says something, they say something in front of him, Rabbi Akiva, we come to a Agadic statement of Rabbi Akiva, where Omer, Ha'av zoche laben benoi v'koach v'osho, is speaking about what the father transmits to the son. Afoya Omer, Hamisha dvarim sheshnem asar chodesh, there are 5 things that will take 12 months. Again, nothing to do with Adayoth. We're not talking about the halachic testimony. So, like I said, this is the conclusion of the unit. In chapter 3, there is a long Mishnah where we see a dispute between Rabbi Dosa ben Arkinas and Chachamim. Rabbi Dosa ben Arkinas was one of the last students of Bet Shammai, and also someone who disputed Rabban Gamliel. But Rabban Gamliel would not argue with him. Same in Mishnah 2. Again, Rabbi Dosa ben Arkinas. Mishnah 3, Mishnah 4, Mishnah 5, Mishnah 6. All these first 6 Mishnayot are all the statements of Rabbi Dosa ben Arkinas. I'll remind you, those of you who listened to Rabbi Daniel Weishab's class last week about the dispute between Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Yoshua, may remember the name of Rabbi Dosa, but here's where he appears in the dispute between Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Yoshua. Rabban Gamliel was the head of the Sanhedrin, was the president, and he dealt harshly with Rabbi Yoshua. Every time Rabbi Yoshua disagreed with him, Rabban Gamliel put him down and embarrassed him publicly. It happened twice. One, the first time it was regarding a question about a bechor, the firstborn of an animal, that Rabbi Yoshua ruled on, and Rabban Gamliel rebuked him publicly, telling him, "You're not allowed to make such a ruling." The third time was the theme that Rabbi Daniel discussed, and that was the question of whether Tfilat Arvit is mandatory or optional. And that was when the dispute between Rabbi Yoshua and Rabban Gamliel was dragged into the open, and people rebelled against Rabban Gamliel and ousted him for a couple of weeks. The second case is recorded in the beginning of Masechet Rosh Hashanah, It was when Rabban Gamliel accepted witnesses regarding the new moon that were later proven to be false witnesses because they testified that the new moon was seen, let's say, on a Tuesday, but on the following night it was not seen. The reaction was negative. The rabbis were not happy with Rabban Gamliel. They felt that his decision was wrong. Two rabbis reacted to it, but only one was punished. The one that we know of that was punished was Rabbi Yoshua. Rabbi Yoshua said whatever he said. We'll get back to it. And Rabban Gamliel was upset with him, and he says, "Guzrani alecha shetavo etzli, you must come to me on your Yom Kippur. You have to break Kippur." But poor Rabbi Yoshua, all he said was, "I agree with Rabbi Dosa." The one who really disagreed publicly with Rabban Gamliel was the man that we just read 6 Mishnayot, quoting his testimonies, Rabbi Dosa ben Arkinas. What Rabbi Dosa ben Arkinas said, those are false witnesses. It's as if saying that a woman gave birth, and on the following day you see that she's still pregnant. Right? He rebuked Rabban Gamliel, saying this is impossible. In reality, there's no way for that to happen. And Rabbi Yoshua told Rabbi Dosa ben Arkinas, "Ro'eh ani et devarecha." What you say makes sense. And Rabban Gamliel retaliates against Rabbi Yoshua. Why is that? Why does he spare Rabbi Dosa ben Arkinas? Because Rabbi Dosa ben Arkinas is too venerable, too respected to be attacked. So he takes it out on someone who is his inferior, or his colleague, but of a lesser position. So Rabbi Dosa ben Arkinas is an important figure. Also, you could look it up. There's a in Masechet Yevamot, I think it might be brought in Adayoth also, a dispute regarding the status of converts from other nations, and the sages go and visit Rabbi Dosa ben Arkinas to ask him a question, and over there also you could see his position of power. So that's an interesting thing that he is brought in Masechet Adayoth in 6 consecutive Mishnayot, all statements of Rabbi Dosa. It's worth it to look him up, read about him, and see his interaction with the rabbis. Then in Mishnah 7, we go back to Rabbi Yoshua, Rabbi Tzadok, Rabban Gamliel, each one like 3 things, 4 things that this one said, the other one said. Then Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Chapter 4. Elu devarim mikulei bet Shammai umechumrei bet Hillel. We enter there's a new list now. The things in which Bet Shammai rule leniently and Bet Hillel rule stringently, right? They're more strict. Betzah shenolda, so and there we have the list. So in that context, I want to say an important distinction, because we hear a lot that it's almost everywhere, the question of leniency and stringency. What is the definition of being lenient and being strict? I mentioned, I think I've demonstrated with many halachot, that you could say about anything that one opinion is stringent or lenient. We could depends on what you're looking at, right? For example, a woman asks whether she could use contraceptives to delay pregnancy, right? And a rabbi says, yes, you can. So people call him lenient. Why? You allowed her to delay her pregnancy. Maybe you're strict. Maybe he's strict because he protects her health, right? Why is it? How do we decide let's say, more common question, right? What bracha do you say for pizza? Those people go to war for that. You should know. Hamotzi, right? I say mezonot. So Boria says hamotzi. I say mezonot. But in Spain, they don't eat that much pizza anyway, right? Right. Yeah. In America, pizza is like water. It's so water is the food, and pizza is just to wash it down. We could say that. So what do you say for pizza? So people say hamotzi. I say mezonot, right? So I'm lenient and you're strict. Why is it that? Where is the stringency? Maybe I'm strict because I don't want to say unnecessary brachot, right? So from my understanding, this is how I came to, after really research and experience, and also the way people talk, really the vernacular, I think that people define stringency and leniency in terms of whose side are you on. There are two parties here, God's side and the human side, right? So if I'm on God's side, I'm strict, and if I'm on the human side, I'm lenient. So, for example, with the pizza, to say hamotzi means to give more thanks to God. So I'm strict. To say mezonot is to make it easier for a person to say the bracha. So I'm lenient. To tell a woman you could delay your pregnancy because you might be in danger, I'm on her side, so I'm lenient. To say no, you can't, I'm on God's side, who said be fruitful and multiply, even if it causes you damage. That's my understanding. So we're strict. Just to have that in mind when we talk about those concepts of being strict and being lenient. So we stopped at the beginning of chapter 4 of Masechet Adayoth, that speaks about kulei. Kulei Bet Shammai v'chomrei Bet Hillel, the lenient halachot of Bet Shammai and the strict halachot of Bet Hillel. You could read, until next week, go through this chapter and see whether this distinction really applies, that it is about whose side are you on, man or God. And then we'll continue with the other chapters of Masechet Adayoth. So I'm going to stop the recording here, and we'll stay on for a while if people have questions about this. What we've discussed today.
Right. Along what you were